My name is Dr. Nicole Hauser, and I am honored and enthused to kick off today's panel in the Language and Social Justice Initiative with my talk entitled Linguistic Diversity as a Measure of a Global Citizen and of Cultural Competency, a call for a multidisciplinary initiative. This is a call for collaborative, critical engagement in how we frame and value language and language learning, and most importantly, learners. I will share scholarship in applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, ratiolinguistics, and composition studies that addresses the urgency of interrogating and transforming policies and practices that perpetuate social inequities and promote linguistic discrimination in the classroom. I will also share examples of our programmatic transformations in RELI toward the goals of transforming these practices. I am making this call for cross-disciplinary engagement, and in particular for colleagues outside of the field of linguistics to engage with and understand work within our field, because without doing so, taking actionable steps toward creating an inclusive, culturally responsive, and global institution is impossible. Language is at the center of our mission across disciplines. The words we use and the ways in which we value or devalue the words used by others excludes or includes participation and membership in our academic community. Furthermore, unlike other fields, educators across disciplines formally and informally evaluate language and are positioned as experts, regardless of their background in linguistics. When giving a cross-disciplinary talk, I like to cite this quote from Lippy Green that I have posted here, which outlines and addresses myth versus fact based in disciplinary divides and the viewpoints of linguists in contrast with non-linguists, and the myths that are based in social inequities and facts based in linguistic research, especially since there is such a long tradition of policies and practices based on these inequities within education, which I will outline. These general differences are included in this box entitled Linguistic Facts of Life, citing Lippy Green here, and include from the linguistics perspective that all languages and varieties are structurally and functionally equal. Grammaticality is socially constructed. There are no broken varieties of any language. Therefore, judgments on language are judgments on speakers. This is central to understanding and engaging in work on language and social justice in education. Furthermore, research overwhelmingly demonstrates the cognitive, social, and emotional benefits of knowing as many codes as possible of linguistic diversity and multilingualism. I now would like to give a brief overview of recent scholarship and approaches in linguistics and composition studies for which social justice is a central focus. I cite Ingrid Pillar here in her work, Linguistic Diversity and Social Justice, where she outlines and describes the assimilationist agenda of language education. The nationalistic agenda of schooling includes the suppression of linguistic diversity and the inculcation of the standard variety of the dominant language as the only legitimate form of linguistic expression. Work in language and social justice engages and interrogates in this framing and the ideologies that create this framing, and acknowledges their roots and their origins in colonialism, racism, xenophobia, and the related policies and practices in the educational setting. Translingual studies is a cross-disciplinary field, subfield of both applied linguistics, bilingual studies, and composition studies. I began as a scholar in Hispanic linguistics, and my introduction to translingualism was through Ofelia Garcia's work in bilingual education, where she aimed to reconcile the discrepancies between theory and practice in bilingual education, specifically the artificial dichotomies and ways of teaching and framing language as discrete entities, and the ways in this was not reflected in the practices of children in Spanish-speaking communities, and the ways in which this framing further led to deficit framing and inefficient practices that further marginalized the student population and deliberately ignored or disparaged their linguistic strengths. Translingual studies seeks to reframe multilingualism as a resource, not a deficit, both in theory, programmatic orientation, and practice. Work in ratiolinguistics further connects and contextualizes language studies and connects language and race, and acknowledges and interrogates deficit and assimilationist framings within the history of colonialism, racism, and xenophobia. I will now describe three common sense framings or traditional framings, accepted framings within the field of education that are rooted in and perpetuate discriminatory policies and practices. And I will suggest ways to reframe them toward linguistic diversity and social justice. A common theme of focus within work in language and social justice and education is the need to critically examine, reframe, and redefine false dichotomies. Disciplinary divisions and student labels of foreign, second, native, non-native not only perpetuate social inequities, but are objectively inaccurate with regard to the linguistic and cultural diversity and repertoire of the student population in higher education in the United States. In most institutions, Rutgers, New Brunswick included, multilingualism is the rule, not the exception. Yet multilingual programs, initiatives here and elsewhere carry the history of other. I have cited an example here from Jonathan Hall at CUNY, where he describes the demographic data of the student population showing the knowledge of over 168 languages, 40% of the students speaking languages in addition to English, quote, yet images from a past in which monolingual English is the default norm persists, a wall that separates ESL tutoring from the regular writing center. As I describe these examples, I invite you to reflect upon your own experiences, language use, acceptance of, and engagement with these framings. The consequence of false dichotomies and other deficit framings results in an exclusionary atmosphere and discriminatory practices. Data from an LEP survey at Rutgers, led by Dr. Kristen Syrett, showed a contrast between the comfort level of use of languages other than English for multilingual students at Rutgers on campus compared to with home. The results of this survey were key in continuing our LEP work and establishing this initiative. Examining the ways in which we have historically defined academic and standard language is also central to scholarship in language and social justice in education. Historically, academic language has been presented and framed as objective, an objective definable entity. This is a coded term, and I will leave it to Dr. Syrett to further explain coded terminology in her next talk. Across disciplines, the acknowledgement of academic language as, quote, foundational to European colonialism, citing Flores here, and tied to racism and white supremacy, has been engaged across fields in linguistic and writing studies. Although acknowledgement and full engagement institutionally has yet to happen. This framing is central to deficit framing of speakers of other non-academic varieties, students culturally, racially, and linguistic outside of the imagined standard. This framing also contributes to placing more of a communicative burden on the speaker of the, quote, accented variety in relationship to the listener, and perpetuates ineffective practices failing to build upon the linguistic strengths of multilingual students. And I would like to direct you to the recent article by Nelson Flores, From Academic Language to Language Architecture, Challenging Ratiolinguistic Ideologies in Research and Practice, that demonstrates this. One final note on academic and standard language. Responses, and often very emotional responses from non-linguists, recall Lippy Green here, often cite the loss of, quote, intellectual rigor, with calls to critically engage in how we define academic language. Yet the traditional framing of academic language promotes a narrowing of perspectives toward one way of understanding, describing, and interpreting the world around us and constructing knowledge. Whereas an orientation toward linguistic diversity and an expanded version and view of academic language would lead to a more intellectually rigorous approach. Finally, I would like to address the need for and ways in which we can interrogate and transform privileging deficit over diversity framing programmatically. Within a deficit model, students with marked language differences are often separated and isolated physically and programmatically. In Crossing Divides, Horner and Tetrall acknowledge this practice, stating, translingual pedagogy seeks to issue a resounding no to monolingualism's insistence that students marked by marked differences be quarantined as ESL and kept from admission to the academic community as full members. Other structural and programmatic inequities linked to deficit framing are non-credit and remedial courses, curricula in service solely to a proficiency standard, which are often grammar-based, level or skills-based, or numbered, with deficit language prevalent at all levels in programmatic description, syllabi and evaluations, error-focused and policing language and description of students. Curricular and programmatic changes transforming these practices include creating contextualized, culturally responsive programming that builds and expands upon students' diverse linguistic strengths, disciplinary and cultural knowledge. And I'm going to share an example of some of the programmatic changes we made at Rutgers English Language Institute. This is just sort of an overview here. Rutgers English Language Institute was created to unify three formerly separate entities dedicated to English language learners in the writing program, pre-undergraduate, undergraduate, and graduate programs and populations. The population of RELI consists of scholars whose primary lived and academic experiences are outside of the United States. The three separate programs were created as support programs with courses that were aligned with deficit framing to varying degrees. Over the past year and a half, I, along with my colleagues in RELI, have reframed the mission and curriculum across all three programs, primarily defining and identifying our institute as a global community of scholars and educators, with our mission and visions as mentoring scholars in a global academic community, creating global scholarship and dialogues, and building curricula and programming toward global competency and linguistic diversity. I have included some of the key programmatic highlights and changes here. One key change that I'd like to highlight is the expansion of collaborative courses and programming across student populations with exchanges such as global ambassadors through the Language Engagement Project, where students, RELI students and other students and all other academic students at Rutgers are sharing their linguistic and cultural and disciplinary expertise. I began this talk with a call to join me collaboratively across disciplines, and I will end this talk with that call. For others within my field and outside of my field to collectively join me in this work. I have included a quotation here from Kristen Tardy's 2015 study on the discourses of diversity and internationalization in US universities and writing programs. Tardy found that institutions draw on discourses of global leadership, global citizenry, diversity, and inclusion but language is rarely an integral part of these discourses. This is not surprising, as the framing of academic language has been historically narrow and assimilationist, as I have just outlined. And as I outline, academia's narrow framing of academic language has placed a greater communicative burden on the speaker and writer of what has been constructed as marked or accented speech, and not the listener, in particular, the white European American English-speaking listener. This framing has translated into limited accountability for intercultural and global competencies across the curriculum and the institution. A framing toward valuing linguistic diversity and an inclusive and expansive definition of academic language is critical to our mission to creating an inclusive, diverse, and global academic community. In what ways and to what extent have you interrogated deficit framings and ideologies? How can we collaborate across disciplines and across institutions, as I know that many of you within the field have begun similar initiatives toward language and social justice, and to reframe policies and practices toward linguistic diversity? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hauser. Thank you so much. Now it is my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Kristen Syrett. Kristen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Doaa, for all of your hard work organizing this webinar and all of your support for the Language Engagement Project. And thank you everyone for attending and also being very patient with any kind of technological challenges we're facing, which I'm sure we're all accustomed to and we recognize as a part of our modern Zoom world. And also thank you, Rebecca, for all of your support as Dean of Humanities for the Language Engagement Project and the departments who are involved in this. I am thrilled that I see a number of my undergraduate students here, because the messages that I want to send as part of this talk are not just for academics who are in the world of research or teaching, but for everyone who is concerned about social justice. And I will preface by saying that in a couple of my slides, I do include the F word. So if I'm just giving you a heads up, I don't say it, it's in an image. So I want to emphasize 3 points about language and its role in social justice in the course of this talk. First of all, language is always interpreted in a rich social context. There are no words and utterances in a vacuum. Every time a speaker delivers an utterance, that is a speech act. It is in context with the speaker and the surroundings, the time, location, as a very important part of how to interpret that utterances and the words that the speaker utters. Second of all, language shapes our perspective about the world and each other. It can do this in ways that are positive and negative, and I'll show you examples of both. And finally, language creates categories and establishes boundaries. This is something that I know very well as a language acquisitionist and a psycholinguist. It's something that I know from my training in cognitive psychology and cognitive science. Language has a very important role of creating categories and boundaries that are correlated with concepts and philosophical sortals. With the same thing we see between language and cognition, we see with language and society and language and culture. It has a way in culture and society of establishing who's part of the in-group and who's part of the out-group. So let's dive right in and look at how words occur in a context. And I'll start with a quote from someone who has been a role model for me in the field of linguistics and specifically in semantics and looking at women and gender, who I know is here today, Sally McConnell-Genet, who says that words in and of themselves are impotent. It is the socially structured practices and historically situated circumstances constituting our social lives that pour content into words, endow them with meaning and power. And I hope that what I illustrate to you in the following examples shows just this, that a word such as patriot or patriotic can be imbued with different interpretations depending on the context and who uses this label. So what is patriotic and who is a patriot? And I'll show you a contrast in 2 different cases. On the one hand, we have Colin Kaepernick, who is an activist and a former NFL quarterback, who chose to kneel during the national anthem, the so-called anthem protest, in order to highlight the oppression and the disproportionate violence faced by Blacks in our country today. He simply took a knee during the national anthem at an NFL game and continued to do so. By contrast, we have Kyle Rittenhouse, who is the 17-year-old who was charged with 2 counts of homicide in connection with protest shootings in Kenosha, Wisconsin, after Jacob Blake was shot and killed. Colin Kaepernick said of his own protest, "I am not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses Black people and people of color." So Colin Kaepernick chose a strategy that is very much in line with the civil rights movement, which is peaceful protest. He didn't disrupt the game. He didn't disrupt the anthem. He simply took a knee. Some people were supportive of this act and said, "I can think of nothing more American than to peacefully stand up or take a knee for your rights anytime, anywhere, or any place." That's from Beto O'Rourke, a former representative from Texas. But he wasn't the only perspective on this. Roger Goodell, the NFL commissioner, said, "I support our players when they want to see change in society, and we don't live in a perfect society. We live in an imperfect society. On the other hand, we believe very strongly in patriotism in the NFL. I personally believe very strongly in that." So by contrasting his action, Kaepernick's action on the field, and saying, on the other hand, we believe very strongly in patriotism, Roger Goodell did not have to come out and say that's unpatriotic. He made it very clear what the stance was at that time. But his view was soft in comparison to others that were posted on social media. People took to the screens and the web to say things like, disrespect is disrespect. It is not patriotic to disrespect your country. The NFL is dead to me. Dissent by disrespecting your country, flag, and military is not a form of patriotism. And others said, you cannot make this into patriotism, no matter how you may twist it. Shame on you. So from these perspectives, it does not matter what your motivations are for taking a knee. As long as you are disrespecting the flag, you are being unpatriotic. And this is not the first time that some kind of action connected to the flag has been called into question whether or not someone is being patriotic. So in 2015, a Virginia-based photographer and veteran herself, Vanessa Hicks, took pictures of a baby who was held by an American flag or propped up by a flag. And Fox News started with a headline, "Is photo of baby in flag patriotic or disgraceful?" So very clearly, we've got 2 mutually exclusive ideas here, or concepts of how this particular act could be construed. There are certain rules about what you're supposed to do with the flag, and you're not allowed to drape them on individuals or use a flag as a carrier. So in that respect, people who labeled this as something that should not be allowed were abiding by the rules of how we treat our American flag. Kaepernick's actions are certainly not the first time that an African-American athlete has chosen their platform in order to protest oppression and violence and practices that persist in our country. So we have examples from Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who were at the 1968 Summer Olympics, joined with by Australian Peter Norman. And they chose to take this platform as a chance of calling attention to the oppression of Blacks in our country, raising their fists and simply bowing their heads during the national anthem. And they got a lot of flack for this. Turning then to Kyle Rittenhouse, his lead lawyer says of Kyle that he will go down in American history alongside that brave unknown patriot who fired the shot heard round the world. In this case, Kyle actually fired multiple shots and killed 2 people. He represents the view of a patriot who is someone who is taking back what is, they think, rightfully theirs and using violence to achieve that goal. And Kyle's lawyer, who presumably is getting paid to say these things, is not the only one who thinks this about Kyle. In fact, many people protested and thought that Kyle was being persecuted. And Tucker Carlson on Fox News, in fact, says, what else is a 17-year-old supposed to do when the law enforcement fails you? We can also look at the recent Capitol siege and see how patriot and patriotic were used in that context. As a reminder, on January 6th, a number of individuals stormed the Capitol grounds, yelling, "Fight for Trump, Trump has lost the election," and so forth. And in fact, in this case, blue lives didn't seem to matter to a number of these individuals as they stormed the walls and created gallows to show hanging. As they were storming through the outside, they were also storming into the chambers and yelling things like, "We need fresh patriots to the front." You can see the video capturing these scenes on a number of different sources on the web now. This was what was shown on the first day of the impeachment trials. In light of all of this, there were people who called these individuals patriotic and labeled them as patriots. So Ivanka Trump tweeted, "American patriots, any security breach or disrespect to our law enforcement is unacceptable. The violence must stop immediately. Please be peaceful." Not everyone thought that these people were patriots. In fact, Jake Sherman, who was a journalist who was trapped inside the Capitol, said, "American patriots, I'm sitting here in lockdown. The Capitol has been breached and people have guns drawn. What are you talking about?" So here there's a very different perception of what it means to be a patriot. Ivanka's tweet was later deleted, but one that stood up was one that was tweeted later in the day, much later in the day, to see actually the kind of violence that was done. And even in light of that, these individuals are still called patriots. These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever. Quite an articulate tweet from this individual. The second point I want to make is that language shapes our perspectives. This may seem quite obvious when we contrast the way that Fox News and CNN portray different events. And we can look at this starting with the ruling from the Supreme Court about marriage between same-sex couples. This is the ruling in 2015 for Obergefell and Hodges, in which the Supreme Court ruled that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples. CNN announced this news by broadcasting the headline, "Same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states." Given the same event and the same Supreme Court decision, Fox News announced, "Supreme Court bars states from refusing to recognize gay marriage." Anyone who has taken a class in pragmatics and knows anything about the Gricean maxims will know that this is a flagrant violation of the manner maxim in order to convey a particular kind of implicature. We also see a change in perspectives with regard to the description and the portrayal of the shooting of Philando Castile, who was someone who worked at a school, who was pulled over as a suspect, who told the police officer that he had a gun, that he had a permit, and was shot multiple times in front of his girlfriend and a 4-year-old in the backseat of a car. Fox News leads with a picture of the police officer who shot Philando Castile looking straight at us, giving us eye contact, with the headline, "Philando Castile shooting, Minnesota officer did what he had to do." The words that we're reading here are the police officer's words. By contrast, CNN starts by saying, "Officer who shot Philando Castile found not guilty on all counts. We immediately know that from this heading that the police officer went to court." And instead of showing us that police officer, they show the grieving mother of Philando Castile. We also see it in the perspective that the St. Anthony Police Department took, describing Yanez no longer being part of the police force. The city of St. Anthony has concluded that the public will be best served if Officer Yanez is no longer a police officer in our city. According to the city statement, the city intends to offer Officer Yanez a voluntary separation agreement to help him transition to another career other than being a St. Anthony officer. In light of his actions, it sounds like he's working with someone in career services to find another career path. The third point I want to make about language in connection with social justice is that language creates categories and therefore creates boundaries. And in the context of society and culture, that means showing us who's part of a group and who's outside of that group. and it helps us to identify who we are and what roles we have. We see this very clearly in the messages that we send and receive about gender. So the University of Arizona at one point created a guide to how we avoid gender bias in reference letters, noting that it was very frequently the case that women who were being recommended for a position were described with so-called grindstone adjectives. They were great at working on committees, they were conscientious, they were dependable, they were hardworking, they were helpful, they were warm. But it was the men who were intellectual and talented and insightful and ambitious. So the University of Arizona recommended that there are certain adjectives to avoid and certain adjectives to include. Is there anything inherently wrong with these adjectives? No, of course not. I'm someone who has devoted my career to investigating gradable adjectives from a semantic perspective. There's nothing inherently wrong with these. It's the context that imbues them with a particular meaning and a portrayal of the individual being described. We also see this description of words attached to particular gender groups in Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, which was both influential and provocative and controversial. Sheryl Sandberg writes, "She is very ambitious is not a compliment in our culture. Aggressive and hard-charging women violate unwritten rules about acceptable social conduct. Men are continually applauded for being ambitious and powerful and successful, but women who display these same traits are often pay a social penalty." And we see this in women in the workforce, but we also see it very early on that the language that we use to describe gender happens right from infancy with gender reveal parties and ways of welcoming children into the world. We see this in Gymboree's marketing of onesies that labeled the infants in these onesies as smart like dad or pretty like mommy, where there was no smart like mommy or handsome like dad alternative. And one would think this was quite egregious, and yet JCPenney also marketed a shirt that said, "I'm too pretty to do homework, so my brother has to do it for me." The girl who purchases the shirt is presumably not able to devote her time to homework. JCPenney says, "Who has time for homework when there's a new Justin Bieber album out? She'll love this tee that's just as cute and sassy as she is." I did not buy this tee for my daughter. We also see this as children develop. There is a very influential set of studies that were done in cognitive psychology, one of which was Bayan et al. Published in Science, in which they conducted multiple studies. I'll report the findings of 2 of them here. They presented images to 5, 6, and 7-year-olds and asked them to identify who is really, really smart. In one study, they gave children a story, a vignette about someone who is really, really smart, and showed the children multiple images of men and women, such as the ones I have here, and asked them to guess who it was. In another, they gave children 2 images back to back, a pairwise comparison, forced choice task, and asked them to guess which one is really, really smart. And being good experimenters, they had a control condition in which they asked them to guess who was really, really nice. What we're looking at here in the graph I'll show you next is how boys and girls responded in these tasks. So this is a line graph that shows how the boys in blue and the girls in red responded based on their own gender. So how often are girls or boys willing to say that someone of their own gender, keeping in mind that gender is a social construct, willing to say that that person is really, really smart or really, really nice? And what we see here is at 5, we don't see a difference. But as children get older, 6 to 7-year-olds, boys are more likely to think that other males are very, very smart. Girls tend not to think that. By contrast, girls who are 6 and 7 think that other girls or women are probably really, really nice. This brilliance equals males stereotype, therefore, appears to be endorsed by children as young as 6 years of age. It does not matter that these individuals, these children, came from middle or upper middle class environments in which their moms, their female caregivers, may have been hardworking women with careers themselves. Despite all of that, they are surrounded by a society that reinforces these stereotypes with the language we use. And it even comes up with Sheryl Sandberg herself, who says the good news is that not only can women have both families and careers, they can thrive while doing so. This is a tough pill to swallow, especially when she tells the graduating class of Barnard College, I have great hopes for the members of this graduating class. I hope that you, yes, you have the ambition to lean into your career and run the world, because the world needs you to change it. Women all around the world are counting on you. So it's not enough that you feel the pressure of your career and your family and you feel marginalized, but it's up to you, girl, to make that change. But Michelle Obama doesn't buy it and says it's not always enough to lean in because that stuff doesn't work all the time. Marriage still ain't equal, y'all. It ain't equal. I tell women that the whole you can have it all, nope, not at the same time. That's a lie. We see the categories in the messages we send about who belongs, and we've seen that also in recent events in our own field of linguistics. And I'll illustrate this to you with an anecdotal example and then one that is an actual example that happened in the field very recently. I won't take sides on the matter. I'll let you decide based on the statement what might have been going on. So say I go to one of my favorite restaurants in Philadelphia, Amada, which has a really fantastic tapas menu and also has a really great wine list. Amada, presenting Spanish cuisine, has a really wonderful, eclectic, from my perspective, wine list and has a lot of Spanish options. Let's say I invite my friend who is not a wine connoisseur to this fantastic restaurant in Philly, and he feels a little bit like a fish out of water. And he says, I recognize only one wine on this list. I take that as meaning he's ignorant about the wines on this list and he has a lot to learn, but he's maybe willing to try and have a glass of wine with me. We can take a very similar statement that was recently uttered by someone who is also associated with the field of linguistics. I recognize only one name among the signatories. This statement comes from Steven Pinker, who simply had to speak out because he was being canceled. A letter was written by hundreds of linguists in the field that said that he had a history of speaking over genuine grievances and downplaying injustices, frequently misrepresenting facts, and at the exact moments when Black and Brown people are mobilizing against systemic racism and for crucial changes. This is what the letter said, and his response, among many other statements he made, was, I recognize only one name among the signatories. In a video that you can see on YouTube where he's interviewed by Freddie Sayers on Lockdown TV, he says, there were several hundred names on it. Very few of them were well-known linguists, names that I recognized. What he intended here was the claims about me by this motley crew of linguistic signatories can be discredited and ignored because these individuals aren't important or established enough to be taken seriously. Another salient alternative interpretation, however, is I'm ignorant about the identity of hundreds of contemporary linguists doing meaningful research in the field who aren't members of an elite club of intellectual luminaries, and therefore I'm out of touch with the field of linguistics, much like Bernie with the wine list at Amada. What I hope that I've illustrated here is the power of language, that language is always interpreted in a rich social context, it shapes our perspectives, and it creates categories and establishes boundaries. Language is powerful. You can either use it to disseminate conspiracy theories and false information, or you can use it to improve upon the situations in our culture, in our society, in our universities. I'll leave with a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, in response to Black student protests in the 1920s, who said, and here again, we are always actually or potentially saying hush to children and students. We are putting on the soft pedal. We are teaching them subterfuge and compromise. We are leading them around to back doors for fear that they shall express themselves. And yet whenever and wherever we do this, we are wrong, absolutely and eternally wrong. This is a call to leave you with a final message that education in the humanities is that much more relevant and meaningful now more than ever. So if you are wondering as students, is my major or minor in linguistics, in women and gender studies, in history, English, any of the world languages, is it relevant? Will it do anything for me beyond the university? Yes, you can be a participant in democracy by helping to shape the way in which we use language and work towards social justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kristen. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Kathleen Riley from the Anthropology Department, and she's going to talk to us about what does anthropology really have to do with language and social justice, among other things, of course.
Thank you. So, thanks. Good. So Katie is in charge of my PowerPoint because I'm dialing in on a phone due to the fact that I'm in northern Vermont, where the internet bandwidth is not so great. Northern Vermont being actually the Missisquoi tribe of the nation of the Abenaki is the actual territorial name. But I don't blame the Abenaki for my lack of internet. But it is to warn you that I may go in and out. We shall see. I'm hoping. So thanks so much. Great rallying cries from both of you, Kristen and Hauser. And I am very grateful for you having invited me to be the anthropological perspective, the anthropological voice today. And as you can see, my title, what's anthropology got to do with it? Can you give me my next slide, Katie? So I'll begin with kind of a predictable anthropological deconstruction of our title here today, Language and Social Justice. It's a phrase that's come to stand for so much to so many, yet these meanings and stances are not transparent. They were constructed in particular ways and in particular contexts by particular people. And thus we need to know what those ways, contexts, and people are in order to know what this phrase means when we use it or when others say it. So to begin, in a way totally typical for the typically linguistic anthropologist that I am, let me take these words apart so you'll have a better idea of where I'm coming from. So by language, I and many of my ilk now mean something far broader than just words and grammar. We see language as the multiplex ways through which humans communicate. From embodied speech and signing to singing and texting, food and dance, cartoons and conceptual art, we want to have it all. We use all our senses to mean so many things, social, emotional, as well as referential, and to perform so many things, from informing to fake news, from prayer to drag. We do things with our language. By social, anthropologists mean the many, meaning variable, diverse, and elaborated, the many ways in which humans organize ourselves on this planet. We say we take a holistic approach to doing this by looking at everything from the biology of primates and our hominin ancestors as they adapted to various environments, to the forms of technology and religion, the economic and political systems, the cultural practices and beliefs, the linguistic varieties and artistic genres, both past and present. With our eye on understanding cultural and linguistic variation through space and time, we triggered the notions of cultural relativity. That is, the way humans do things differently needs to be understood on their own terms. We also initiated this term ethnocentrism. That is, the fact that we grow up seeing the world differently means we must work all the harder, but indispensably, to see past our cultural blinkers. Finally, the word justice. Like all words in the lexicon of a linguistic community, this one gets bandied about with many socially constructed meanings, which index who we are, how we were raised, where we are oriented, and these meanings change across sociocultural contexts, varying in their effect, both with the intent of the speaker and the stance of the listener. So, given our inevitably ethnocentric blinkers, we may not always hear what others are meaning when they use the word. I acknowledge that my own ideas of justice borrow from, on the one hand, my grandmother, but that's another story, and at least two prior thinkers, John Rawls and Nancy Fraser. First, I hold the idea that while we may strive for justice as a universal goal and a human right, another term in need of deconstruction, it may not yet be possible to find a one-size-fits-all definition of justice for every person in every society. And certainly we humans have not yet found the practices or institutions for allotting even some compromised version of justice fairly and equitably to all parties, whether individuals or whole communities, in all corners of the world. Secondly, and while acknowledging that already constrained notion of justice, I understand that it can be sought in three material and symbolic forms. First, equitable resource distribution. Second, respectful cultural recognition. And third, political access to representation or voice. As this last word, voice, indicates, language in its many modes and meanings has a role to play in all this as humans attempt to socially organize themselves in ways that may approximate justice. So the next slide for me, Katie. So having said all this, I should tell you that linguistic anthropologists have been working on the relationship of language to social justice for a very long time and in various ways, because we have long understood that language is a form of social practice that operates variably depending on the sociocultural context. In fact, one of our respected elders, Anna Celia Zentea, coined a phrase for her commitment to exploring activist approaches to researching this issue. She called it anthropolitical linguistics. It emerged out of her work on bilingual language socialization with Puerto Rican children in New York City in the 1980s, and she has carried it forward into the present century with her work on how the US Census refers to families who use a language other than English in the home. She has been working tirelessly to find a respectful term that would fit the quantitative methods of the census, that is succinct yet easy to understand, and has been objecting most recently to the use of the term limited English proficiency, as this is acronymized, if that could be a word, into LEP, and therefore those being enumerated by the census turned into lepers. And just by the way, I've had trouble with Rutgers Language Engagement Program's title due to that unfortunate associative resonance in my mind with its acronym. Not that you should change it, just letting you know how minds work in this way, of course. So in any case, let me now unpack what research activists committed to anthropolitical linguistics attempt to do, or rather first, what axiomatic understandings we work with. First, we understand that language is a conduit for our ideologies, much as Kristen was talking about, frequently operating as the metaphors we live by, as George Lakoff phrased it. For instance, words are potent vehicles for beliefs and stances, many of them unconscious or unquestioned. For instance, it has long been observed that words make a difference when media and politicians choose terms for the various ways in which humans gather and move around, apparently collectively, in places where the material and symbolic goods of others are on display. Their actions are variably described as either violent or peaceful, and they are organized around whether they are organized around a political issue or not, and whether that issue is defined as false dogma. And then they are labeled as either demonstrators and protesters or as rioters and terrorists, as Kristen was talking about. So much depends on these terms and how they circulate, who produces them and who consumes them. And then, as we are seeing this week in the US Senate, what are done with those words and who takes a stand, given how they are weaponized, as we say in the verbal debates of our time, frequently understood according to the metaphor of war, as Lakoff told us long ago. Another instance of terms that have made a difference in many of our lives have to do with sex, race, and class. What does the N-word carry and who does it harm when produced, when, where, how, and by whom? How does the AP's decision to eliminate the I-word out of respect for our valued migrant laborers, or not, because the media does continue to use it? Though on the positive column, the Biden administration did restore the Spanish language translation of the White House website the very afternoon of his inauguration. And what would switching to the gender neutral singular pronoun they mean for all of us? I also wonder if youth under 25 even know that English speakers used to, and not so long ago, refer to all humans as men. This had its consequences, and the change has been very welcome. Second, and this is closer to what Nicole was discussing, language is shaped by and thus reflects the micro and macro political economics of its social use. That is, there is a symbolic marketplace that correlates with the material marketplace. And in those contexts, both local and global, the languages we know and the ways we speak them are valued and devalued and revalorized in ways that reflect the political economic fortunes of their speakers. And of course, also facilitate or undermine those fortunes as a result. Communicative hegemony is the phrase formulated by another of our wise elders, Charles Briggs. And this term is used to discuss the interdiscursive regime that enlists people in devaluing and delegitimizing their own, as well as others' voices. That is, by contrast with the dialect, the linguistic variety mastered by the elite of any society, who, given their political economic power, declare it to be the standard for all. The many other dialects spoken by those from denigrated regions, ethnicities, and classes are stigmatized along with their speakers. Thus, these speakers end up feeling linguistically insecure if and to the extent to which they buy into the judgmental dogma they're taught at school about the ways in which they express themselves most articulately. For instance, by contrast with the illusory standard English of the US, a number of rich linguistic varieties have been devalued, including African American English and Nuyorican Spanglish, while others in the Francophone world, where I do my research, have been devalued by contrast with Parisian French. For example, the joual of rural working class Quebec, or the Southern French dialects spoken by Bourdieu in his Childhood Béarn. Is there any wonder then that he, another elder adopted by anthropologists as kin, despite his being a sociologist, he went on to formulate the concept of linguistic capital, that is, the notion of a discursive currency that gives some people both symbolic and material power over others. Finally, and in part because of these semiotic regimes, language can be used to resist them and reclaim material resources, cultural recognition, and political representation, or as some would encapsulate it, recapture their voice. For the rest of my presentation, I'm going to present just a little of my anthropolitical linguistic research on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that being the sort of location that anthropologists sometimes, not always, go to in order to understand the full variable spectrum of how humans communicate and organize themselves, for better or worse. In particular, I'll focus on my work with respect to the cultural and linguistic revitalization and resource sovereignty movement there in this part of the still colonial collectivity of French Polynesia, called by the French les Marquises, or as the people of this archipelago call themselves, Te Enana, or the people. Katie, can I see the next slide? So to do this, I'll need to, might help, to situate you in time and space with a map and timeline and tell you a bit about the various ways in which social justice, economic, political, cultural, and linguistic has been problematized, made into a problem for Te Enana. First, note that they were the first humans to arrive in this archipelago around 1,000 years ago, having set off from the east in large double-hulled sailing vessels, most recently from Samoa and or Tonga, but much further back, basically from Asia. They arrived with their Polynesian language, cultural foodways, and forms of social organization, governed in particular by notions of tapu and mana. 1595 is the date when the islands were first mapped by Europeans, that is, given the name of the Marquesas, in honor of the patron of the Spanish explorer Quiros. Real European interference did not begin, however, until the late 1700s as whalers and sandalwood traders, scientists, explorers, warriors began to circulate through looking for food and sex and bringing the usual luggage of diseases, guns, and alcohol. Can I have the next slide, Katie? So intense depopulation over the course of the 19th century led to a high degree of sociocultural disruption. And this was only reinforced by the French colonial administration that set up house there in 1842, as well as the Catholic missionaries who outlawed all the so-called pagan practices, feasting and dancing, tattooing and tapu, that had provided the social skeleton, the fabric of life, the cultural meaning for Te Enana's sovereignty prior to that. Next slide. So By the 20th century, villages of the remaining population had been organized instead around churches, ports of call for global capitalism, and eventually schools. These, along with employment in tourism and the French nuclear bomb testing infrastructure that was set up in the latter half of the 20th century, have posed the largest threats to the maintenance of Te Eo Anana, that is, the language of the people. Next slide. Thanks. Today, with just a few minutes left, I'll introduce three language and social justice issues. Just a few salient words, first of all, and then secondly, the socialization of a devalorized code locally called Sarapia. And third, the attempts by a cultural revival and language revitalization movement of the last 50 years to reclaim Te Anana's sovereignty, economic, cultural, and political. So next slide. First, just a little bit about the words and those ethno-linguistic identities that are attached to them. So in Te Eo Anana, the language of the people, there are words that are rich in just the cultural significance of who they consider themselves to be. They use the word ka'oha, which means hello. It means welcome. It means gift. This really signifies what they think of themselves as being, a welcoming, hospitable people. They use the word kanahau, magnificent. They talk about their Pacific islands, these volcanic islands just erupting up out of the ocean, out of an ocean without beaches, without coral reefs. They consider this kanahau, magnificent. And that you'll see the K, that K sound becomes really salient for them in many words to sort of distinguish themselves from others. Te Anana have been called the Marquisien by the French, and there's a K sound in it. They distinguish themselves from the Farani, the French, no K there. They distinguish themselves from their neighbors, the Tahitians, who have become basically their overlords by reason of the French colonial administration. And they distinguish it from karaihi. Karaihi is the word for rice and uncircumcised penis and disgusting invader. So karaihi, it's a word that I hear. I know it means rice, but I hear myself being called a karaihi. I understand that despite being a welcoming people, they have not felt so good about the invaders who have been in their midst. So finally, I see that my time is up, that I need to finish up. The next slide takes you to how a particular formation of a code, a mixed code, referred to locally as Sarapia, has been demonized there in ways that are now interfering with the maintenance and revitalization of Te Eo Anana. And what we see here is this feedback loop between practices and ideologies found in schools and homes. You have the French education system that created one ideology that French makes one civilized, allows development. And then the practices that schooling was all in French and Te Eo Anana's use was punished. Also, children mix their Te Eo Anana into their French, not being perfect speakers of French. And the ideology that the French spoken by Te Anana was charabia, which is French for gobbledygook. So that word charabia became Sarapia, Marquesanized. And in the home, the language socialization, women then mixed French and Anana at home to help their children get ahead at school. They wanted to introduce them to French early. This produced an ideology that they were speaking a Sarapia, which was not pure Inana either, who wasn't pure French, wasn't pure Inana, and the ideology that they must now they've been told that they must maintain our language, its humanities heritage, they must do this, and the children in practice are mocked for their Sarapia, and they quit trying to speak Marquesan Te Eo Anana at all. So the final slide, or not really, but finally, the sovereignty movement that began in the 1970s has had mixed results, in part because of its ideological roots in global ideologies about the importance of preserving endangered environmental resources, as well as cultural and linguistic traditions for the sake of humanity. I've set up a timeline of the global ideologies and, oops, are we not? Yes, we are there, sorry. I've set up this timeline, this 2 columns, as set up timelines of the global ideologies on the one hand and the activist movements undertaken in Te Henua o Te Anana side by side, so you can at least visualize the obvious correlations, if not the precise processes by which those global ideologies affected the practices in the Marquesas. But just one example of the latter would be the fact that the cultural revival movement actually spearheaded by the French Archbishop at that time, who himself was Breton. That is, he grew up in Brittany at a time when French imperialism was doing to the Bretons what he did not want to happen to the Marquesans. He did not want to see the people, the culture, and the language die. So he started this movement. Nonetheless, the locals do not always buy into these global discourses and wonder how this translates into actual sovereignty, that is, into them actually having a voice. This is a complex topic, based on many entangled tendrils of ideology and practice that I can't possibly do justice to today. What I can say is that many of the 9,000 plus Inanna who presently reside in their Henua are engaged in figuring these problems out for themselves. And now, in the face of a new planetary health crisis that is familiar threats both to their bodily health, their environment, and their ways of making a living, they are working on it. Because this has consequences for their local understandings of social justice. So my last slide, just by way of conclusion, consider what Te Anana are facing: colonial appropriation and cultural destruction, capitalist extraction and a globalized economy, missionization and education, charabia and linguistic shame. Through their various sovereignty movements, they are attempting to protect their environmental resources, seek autonomy and respect for their culture and language, and activate their political voice, even as they retain their still not post-colonial ties to France. As a researcher activist, I encourage them to celebrate their dialogic identity as French Polynesians and to engage in what I call interactivism, that is, an activism that is based on conscious interaction, in which they may find their voice, a way to name, express, create, and recreate what's important to them. Thanks.